Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first online session of the fall 2024 series of AI Security and Defense Forum. This is a collaborative initiative supported by SINTEF through basic funding from the Research Council of Norway, alumni clubs of MIT, especially in France, Germany, and Norway, and various faculty and staff members of MIT. The field of AI and global geopolitics are two fast evolving areas, and they have become inescapable from one another and are having profound impacts on our lives. And the idea of creating this forum is to open source our learning process and draw contribution beyond our immediate social and professional circles. And so what we will do today is to experiment with the webinar format instead of a typical meeting session, because there has been a recent history of Zoom bombing where you have uninvited guests crashing the sessions. So Olivia will explain how the Q&A will work later. And so before we get to Gabriella, Olivia, I will introduce our co-organizer, Olivia. She is a PhD candidate at MIT hi, Olivia. Olivia studies the intersection of the built environment, diplomacy, and geopolitics during the Cold War and in NATO's emerging operating environments. And Olivia has been in the background curating the content with me, and now she's generous enough to open up more bandwidth for us to start hosting some of the speaker series. So Olivia.
Awesome, Bill, thank you so much. So I am so excited to introduce Gabriella Gricius today, and also to kind of get to know all of you who are participating in the Zoom call. So I have admired Gabriella's work for many years now, and in thinking about my kind of dream list for speakers to invite to the series, she was at the top of it. So she is a research associate at the Arctic Institute, a research fellow with the North American and Arctic Defense and Security Network, or NADSEN, and a PhD candidate in political science at Colorado State University in the subfields of international relations, comparative politics, and environmental politics. Her research areas include Arctic security, ontological security studies, critical security studies, and exploring the roles of experts in national policy and policymaking processes. Gabriella's work has been published in Global Studies Quarterly, the Arctic Yearbook, The Loop, NADSEN, Foreign Policy, and Responsible Statecraft, among other outlets. She is a prolific writer, and I highly suggest that you go to her website and read some of her work because it is fantastic. So I am also excited that she's the first speaker in our series. She's going to give us a great kind of overview of the technological ramifications and landscape in the Arctic, and I think it really sets the stage for a lot of our other speakers this series. One quick note, so with the Q&A, so Gabriella is going to speak, and then we're going to use the Q&A function to kind of get questions from the audience. So just type your question in the Q&A, and I will kind of moderate it from there. But you can also type your Q&A questions during the presentation as well. So Gabriella, welcome. We're so excited to hear what you have to say.
Thanks so much, both of you, for having me, and for the audience for being here as well. So I will just share my screen. Okay. Hopefully that is working. So yeah, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here and talk to everyone. And I've titled my presentation, Pipelines, Cyber Ops, and Disinformation, Hybrid Threats in the Arctic, which sort of gives you a little bit of an introduction of the type of threats that I'm going to be touching on here. And before I get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to highlight that a lot of this work comes from a report that I co-authored with Katarina Kertisova with the European Leadership Network. And Katarina is now a policy officer with NATO, but I would really encourage you to go check out the report where we go into a lot more depth into each of these types of hybrid threats in the region. So during the presentation today, I'm going to start briefly with a background on what are hybrid threats? How should we think about them in the world? And then focusing more specifically in the Arctic. So I'm going to touch on the different types of hybrid threats in the region. What are the two malign actors that we should be paying attention to? And then walk through the different types of threats. So I've outlined a couple here, including cyber attacks, information warfare, physical interference, energy intimidation. And then we're going to talk specifically about China and how a lot of their tactics don't fit into our traditional hierarchy of how we think about these threats broadly. And then I'm going to end with some reflections on what's been going on since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. But before we get to the Arctic, obviously hybrid threats are not just happening in the high north, they're happening across the international system. And the two kind of key examples that I want to draw our attention to are two that you've probably heard of. The first is, of course, Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. So if you remember, in the lead up to the actual annexation, there were little green men that suddenly appeared on the peninsula, and they were unmarked Russian soldiers that didn't have attribution, which is one of the key characteristics of a hybrid threat or attack in a part of the world. This unmarked attribution was followed by a disinformation campaign that was all about targeting and protecting Russian speakers that lived in Ukraine from so-called discrimination. And then now that narrative has evolved towards opposing fascism in Ukraine. And now we see cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure. So you can see it's all part of this coordinated campaign that's using tactics that we don't associate with traditional warfare. And the second example comes from China and its strategy in the South China Sea. So as China's been trying to gain more hegemony in its region, it's been building artificial islands in contested area, engaging in coercive diplomacy, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also in other areas such as Africa and Latin America, using tactics such as debt diplomacy, as well as legal warfare, where it uses historical claims to justify its territorial ambitions. And it lastly uses gray zone maritime tactics, such as using civilian militia and Coast Guard vessels to intimidate and harass others. And what both of these type of global hybrid threats have in common is that responding to them is really difficult. Often responses come too late to really have an impact on this. And when there's trouble attributing blame of these threats to a particular actor, it raises really important questions of how should we deter against these threats? How should we signal to our adversaries that we don't find these types of attacks acceptable? And in the Arctic, hybrid threats are of particular concern because the region is quite large, it's vast, and it's difficult in many cases for southern capital governments to be able to respond to the needs of more isolated local communities. And of course, we've also been seeing an increase in Russian and Chinese hybrid threats. So before we hop into the Arctic, let's just have a moment to talk about some terminology here. You've probably heard a lot of different words when talking about these type of attacks. Maybe you've heard the term gray zone warfare, hybrid threats. A lot of these terms mean very similar things. But if we're going to be very technical to start, gray zone warfare refers to covert or illegal activities that fall below the threshold of armed organized violence. This can mean a lot of different things. I list a couple in the slides. So psychological operations, legal processes. But in general, what matters when we think about gray zone warfare is there's an emphasis on ambiguity and operating in that gray zone of international law and conflict. And these are very much non-military tactics. By contrast, hybrid threats are a type of threats that like to combine different types of approaches. So they combine conventional, asymmetric, irregular activities. And the emphasis here is on the blend of conventional and non-conventional tactics as part of a broader coordinated campaign that exploits all of those different types of warfare techniques. So very similar techniques. And for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to focus on hybrid threats. So, like I mentioned, there are some conceptual differences between hybrid threats and gray zone, but one way that I like to have a little shorthand for myself is that hybrid threats are a broad spectrum of threats that use and take from different types of warfare that all happen generally below the threshold of war. Of course, there's conceptual blurriness behind the term, but some key characteristics here are that it is really difficult to attribute blame for these things, which means that responding is quite difficult. And the trouble here is if we can't deter these threats, how can we really signal to an actor like Russia or China that we don't want these threats to continue? Should we decide to just go ahead and deter, even though we don't have clear attribution? If so, that could be perceived as escalatory by adversaries. So it's important to really figure out how to thread the line between how do we actually gain attribution and what are the options if we actually cannot. But what both hybrid threats and gray zone have in common is largely their goal is to discredit the democratic model and undermine security and sovereignty. So turning to the Arctic, the four buckets that we're going to place a lot of these threats in are hacking and cyber warfare, disinformation and information warfare, physical interference, so actually interference of something physical like a pipeline or a cable that runs along the ocean floor, and energy intimidation. And there's a couple of other types of threats such as GPS jamming and espionage that I'll talk about a bit later in the presentation as well. But before we get there, I just want to note that these hybrid threats across the region, they are not equal across the whole entire Arctic. So kind of trends, normalities that we'll see in parts of the European Arctic are certainly not the same as what's happening in the North American Arctic. And a lot of this has to do with geographic proximity and simply access in general. So for Russia, for example, accessing and being able to engage in more disinformation campaigns might have a lot more resonance in somewhere like Finland or Sweden, where there are larger populations of Russian speakers than that might have in Canada or the United States. So just important to pay attention here that the type of threats that I'm going to touch on are definitely not clear across the region. But let's turn to the actors. So Russia is obviously our kind of key actor that we like to think about when we talk about hybrid threats in the region, and it's generally perceived to be the primary malign actor. And its goals in the region are largely to shore up its own position. So Russia perceives itself as it's this Arctic superpower, right? It has the most land in the Arctic, has the most icebreakers. It's the most kind of dominant Arctic actor by far. And so a lot of the goals that it has in the region are projecting power further, legitimizing its own behavior, and also shoring up its own sovereignty claims, both in a maritime capacity, as well as protecting this oil and gas infrastructure that is really key for the Russian Federation. And its aim is about provoking doubt and disagreement. And the why comes back to Russia does not want to engage in full-scale conflict in the Arctic. And that's for a couple different reasons. The first, as I mentioned, is Russia has an oil and gas infrastructure in the Arctic that is very key for its national security. And so bringing war to the region, bringing actual full-scale conflict would actually be very counterintuitive for Russia to do this. So it wants to keep war away from oil and gas, which it sees as key for its national security. The second aspect is the Northern Sea Route, which is this central maritime shipping corridor that runs close to the Russian coastline in many areas across the Arctic. Now, Russia wants to prop up this shipping route as a new global maritime route. It's, of course, faced a lot of challenges in this, not least for the fact that it's a difficult route to access, and although ice is melting, it's still very challenging. But you can't promote a route if you then wish to bring conflict next to that route. So for Russia, using this toolkit of hybrid threats actually really suits its aims because it allows it to wage this type of adversarial competition towards the West, using state-funded media channels, proxies, all with the aim to provoke doubt and disagreement and decrease the trust that Arctic publics have in their governments. And just to give you an idea here of how prevalent Russia is across the region, I pulled this source from the Stiftung of Wissenschaft und Politik, just to show you how, active Russia is across the region. And so you can see here, there's air bases everywhere. There are oil and gas infrastructures. There are civilian things. Russia is a very Arctic forward power in a way, meaning that it not only has capacity to act in these more civilian and military ways, but also has more places to project these hybrid threats towards the West. The second actor that is a little bit more tricky to deal with is, of course, China. And part of the reason that China is a more difficult actor is that it doesn't outright engage in a lot of the more disruptive behavior that we tend to associate with an actor like Russia. Instead, China's general aim here is legitimacy. So what it wants is to gain a foothold outside the Indo-Pacific. China seeks global hegemony, and part of a way to do that is by trying to gain a foothold in the Arctic, because it sees it as a future key region for resources, competition, as well as cooperation, and has a lot of different tactics for doing this. It does this through psychological operations, legal warfare, media manipulation, but a lot of this comes down to discourse, actually, and the type of language and terminology that China uses to talk about itself in the Arctic. So in 2018, for example, this is perhaps the most common way of thinking, is that China named itself a near Arctic state. What is a near Arctic state? China's not near the Arctic. China's not an Arctic state that falls within the Arctic Circle. But by calling itself a near Arctic state, it was trying to linguistically give itself competence to be more engaged in how decisions are made around the region. But beyond just using language, China also uses tactics that we've seen in other parts of the world. So it tries to engage through a more economic lens, using infrastructure investments. So, for example, China has tried to engage in energy projects, mining, shipping ports, and uses this mutually beneficial language to say that we'll give you money, you can help build these things in places like Greenland or Iceland. But this comes with a potential cost, because we don't know whether China might have undue influence then on a region or countries' politics and economies. This is in other parts of the world known as debt diplomacy, and there are some concerns that China would seek to use this approach in the Arctic, although it's important to note here that this has been largely unsuccessful thus far. And what we'll talk about a bit later as well is there's concerns about China using scientific research as this pretext for gaining more strategic knowledge and interest in the region, as well, of course, as cyber espionage. But talking about the first type of hybrid threat that comes up a lot in the region, this is cyber attacks, broadly speaking. And cyber attacks, of course, is a really big term. It can mean a lot of different things. But there are two types of general cyber attacks that we're seeing in the Arctic. The first is on non-government systems. So attacks on hospitals, healthcare systems, and even energy systems as well. So just to list a couple of examples, in 2022, there was a ransomware attack upon the Greenlandic healthcare system, which had links to espionage to gain some more knowledge about what the general populace's health was. In 2023, Denmark suffered the largest cyber attack on record when Russian hackers hit Danish power companies. And this actually was seen as part of gaining more knowledge about how Denmark's decentralized power grid actually operates, potentially, as trying to understand how could a larger attack then be more disruptive in the future. And while there's not a lot of actually evidence on this, there is suspicions that China is suspected of using cyber espionage campaigns to gather intelligence on defense, energy, and maritime shipping routes. Of course, this is not just happening on non-governmental systems, but also government-affiliated systems like parliament, as well as election authorities. There's been reports of espionage attacks on the Canadian Parliament, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and there's also been denial of service attacks against Finnish websites and Parliament websites, including those from Finland, Iceland, and Norway, and Sweden as well. And interestingly, or perhaps not so interestingly, these attacks often happen in tandem with things that are happening that deal with geopolitics. So, For example, when Finland and Sweden announced that they wanted to join NATO in 2022, there was a vast increase in attacks on government-affiliated websites. Perhaps not super surprising, given that we would expect Russia to react very negatively to this news, but it's very clearly a signaling tactic that the Russian government is trying to show Finland and Sweden, saying, we don't approve of your behavior. Here's part of our campaign to destabilize what's going on inside your government. Another example of this, it happens a lot during exercises. So when there's large NATO exercises or bilateral exercises in the region, there tends to also be a subsequent increase in cyber attacks that happen as well. Interestingly, a lot of these attacks tend to happen more in a European Arctic context than a North American. But there's a lot of question here about transparency, because what we, the public, know about cyber attacks is what is reported in newspapers. So it's more than likely that there are many more attacks that are happening in the Arctic that we're just not hearing about, hopefully because they're unsuccessful in nature. The second type of hybrid threat that's important to pay attention to is, of course, the question of disinformation. And when we think, what's a really common example of disinformation, we go back to the question of China. And like I mentioned, China wants to use a lot of these narratives of itself as a legitimate Arctic actor to try to gain more influence in the region. So China likes to paint itself as this kind of for the benefit of all humanity. So the way that China paints its scientific research agenda, the way that it talks about its engagement in the Arctic is through this appealing to everyone, appealing for the benefit of the Earth kind of narrative. But this is also a strategy to gain more engagement in the region, to try to be part of decisions that are being made, because we don't know how decisions about resources, about competition or cooperation are going to square out in the future. But from a Russian landscape, we also see more traditional types of disinformation. And so Russia uses two primary channels to do this, both state-owned channels, so Sputnik and Russia Today. And they promote particular types of narratives that we're more used to seeing and associate with hybrid threats. The first is Russia being superior over the West. This is not surprising. This also happens outside of the Arctic as well. But there's a lot of language that talks about Russia being this predominant Arctic stakeholder, kind of, as we talked about, shoring up this legitimacy. And then in tandem to that, really emphasizing the fact that Russia needs to defend its territory against the US and NATO, which it frames as largely being destabilizing to the region. And these two narratives about Russia defending its territory, the US and NATO being destabilizing, obviously saw a huge increase in the wake of Finland and Sweden's wish to join NATO. So right after that happened, there was this explosion, of different types of news articles, a lot of bots coming up in Finnish and Swedish chat rooms that were really trying to polarize the conversation amongst local communities to try to say, how do we prevent this from happening? And of course, this was unsuccessful, but there is some, survey data right now showing that there's a large population of younger Finnish and Swedish individuals who actually are a little concerned about NATO membership. While these disinformation narratives maybe didn't stop Finland and Sweden, the states, from joining NATO, if they are successful in creating more doubt and disagreement on a local level, then perhaps they are relatively successful in this sense. And a third example of this is the weaponization of climate change and migration. So this is kind of an interesting tactic where a lot of Russian hackers and bots, they'll take topics that are very polarizing. So do we think climate change is real? How do we feel about refugees and people who are coming to our state and using benefits? And they try to make the conversation much more aggressive, much more polarized online. And in tandem to that, in 2015, Russia actually opened its border and started pushing third country nationals through to Norway and Finland, trying to exploit the migrant crisis and then use disinformation as a way to prop up, fanning the flames of some of those concerns that were happening in Norway and Finland. So this is kind of a side note, espionage. It didn't fit very well into any of the buckets, but I thought it was really important to talk about. So not only, as I mentioned, are we seeing an increase in cyber espionage attempts, but we're also seeing this really fascinating increase in signal intelligence and human intelligence. So since Russia's war in 2022, we've seen this interesting development where there have been unidentified drones that have been trying to go around Norwegian oil and gas critical infrastructure. And part of the reason for that, some analysts are suspecting, is that many European countries have turned away from Russian oil and gas in the wake of the war, which means that they're turning to countries like Norway that have more oil and gas and are able to export in a more serious capacity. And so some concerns are that this increase in espionage over these infrastructures is actually a way to prepare for some sort of future sabotage attempt. But this is just an interesting sort of development. And of course, in tandem to signal intelligence, there's also been an increasing number of spies and operatives that have been discovered as well. And if you've read the news or are engaged in the Arctic like I am, you've probably seen all of these news stories over the past couple of years. A student or researcher at a university in Tromsø, a person located at a diplomatic mission, someone actually within a multinational company, and they're being expelled from places like Norway is the most obvious example of this, back to Russia or back to China. And these examples are actually quite interesting because we would expect that an intelligence organization would actually see a lot of benefit in there being a spy that they are aware of and continuing to let them operate, but within a very small and limited operational capacity. And the fact that the Norwegian government decided that this was not acceptable actually tells us a lot about the fact that this is clearly seen as a threat, and the benefits of allowing this spy to operate really do not, weigh out the potential costs here. So the next bucket that we'll touch on is physical interference. So what's actually happening to infrastructure in the region from a threat perspective. The first example comes from Svalbard, which is a northern archipelago that is owned by Norway. And there were two incidents of hybrid threats that occurred in 2021 and 2022, where both one time an undersea cable disappeared, and then the second time an undersea cable was cut. And in both cases, as we mentioned, one of the key characteristics of hybrid threats is that there was a really questionable attribution. We don't know how this happened. So was it a civilian vessel that accidentally cut the cable? Was it an intentional sabotage attempt using a submarine, for example? Or was it just an environmental accident where the cable got cut on some rock on the bottom of the ocean floor? It's unclear. But what it does show us is how vulnerable this type of infrastructure is to sabotage, because we haven't been thinking about how we should respond to these type of threats in the future. Obviously, the second, beyond just undersea cables, is the fact that there are a lot of cables that hold communication and financial transfer information. And 99% of those cables are transferred on the bottom of the sea. And there's no real secondary alternative to this. So how should we deal with this? And this is an open question. We really don't know how we should start to come up with strategies to protect these type of cables from attacks in the future. Two additional examples before we turn to the next slide have to do with pipelines. So not just cables that pass on information, that maybe help with communications, but rather things that are actually carrying oil and gas. And the first example is in 2022, where we probably all read about the Nord Stream sabotage. And while at the time, most people assumed that this was actually a Russian sabotage attempt, there's been recent news that perhaps this came from a different source. But again, it's still really unclear. There's an open investigation. We're really uncertain how we should attribute blame and to what extent we should be able to respond to these type of threats. And the last example is the Baltic Connector. And so in 2023, just some context, the Baltic Connector was a pipeline that ran between Finland and Estonia. And in 2023, there was a sudden drop in pressure and the cable started leaking, some oil and gas, and they were able to deal with that quite quickly. But there was a Chinese vessel that happened to be going by at the time, known as the Nunu Polar Bear. And at the time, the ship denied any responsibility. They said, no, it wasn't us. But actually, in August 2024, there was an internal Chinese investigation indicating that the ship certainly was actually responsible for this damage. But the investigation claimed that it was an accident due to heavy weather rather than intentional sabotage. And we can certainly choose to believe that. That is one potential truth that could be what happened. But there's also the alternative that perhaps it was not, and something else actually occurred and it was intentional sabotage. The other type of physical interference is that of GPS jamming. And so to take a step back, when we think about operating in the Arctic, whether from a maritime or an aviation perspective, it's a challenging region to operate in. So it's very remote, the distances are very long in between bases, the weather is very extreme, and seasonal conditions can change very quickly. So it's very dangerous to operate in the Arctic, no matter what type of vehicle that you're on, which of course means that GPS is really important, not only for military, but also civilian, maritime and aviation navigation, and most importantly, search and rescue. But what's been happening recently over the last couple years is this increase in GPS jamming that blocks or interferes GPS signaling. And this is particularly a problem. This complicates from a military perspective, command and control efforts. It acts as an intimidation tactic, and it affects civilian assets. And there's two kind of key examples here. The first has to do with NATO's 2018 Trident Juncture, which was one of the largest exercises that happened in northern Norway since the Cold War. And there started to be this GPS jamming that happened during the exercise. And later, Norway actually was able to attribute blame to Russia because they used, some technical strategies to determine that the jamming was coming from a particular location that was adjacent to a Russian area. And so in this case, they were able to attribute blame, but that doesn't mean that the GPS jamming has stopped. It's just mean that it's become more sophisticated and that it's been able to react and change as Norway's attribution measures have also changed as well. But beyond just being affiliated with military exercises, there's now also GPS jamming practices that happen in a civilian capacity. So you'll be flying somewhere or being on a boat somewhere, and suddenly your GPS will stop working, which can be very challenging and troubling. And so how do you respond to that as an operator or as someone trying to make strategy around these spaces? Of course, this means increased monitoring. And actually, a lot of militaries in the Arctic are now developing backup systems for GPS, which is not something they really thought that they would be doing before. A smaller type of threat that we're not seeing as much now, but was much more prevalent right after the war, is this question of energy intimidation. So right after the war, Russia actually responded to countries like Denmark and Finland who were attempting to, support Ukraine by threatening them with cutting off their oil and gas. And this is very clearly, trying to exploit that dependency that a lot of European states had on Russia for these key resources. Ultimately, it was unsuccessful because both states were able to turn more seriously to Norway, to the United States, and to the Middle East as suppliers, but very clearly a hybrid threat used to try to exploit that dependency. So now turning to China, like we mentioned, China is a little bit difficult to fit into GPS jamming, into physical interference, cyber, disinformation campaigns, because they don't act in the same way that Russia does. And like I mentioned, all of this is kind of with the aim of China increasing its presence and trying to become a more legitimized actor in the region. Beyond just trying to purchase infrastructure and trying to invest in parts of the Arctic, China, of course, is also building more icebreakers and becoming more engaged in scientific research in the region. But a lot of these efforts have been curtailed in recent years for a couple of different reasons. The first is, of course, the pandemic. So right after COVID-19, China really took a step back and became more isolationist as it tried to deal with the ramifications of the pandemic, both domestically as well as from an image perspective internationally. The second is the war. So since Russia's invasion, China's really had to reckon with, well, how much should I work with Russia? How much should I push away from Russia and try to work with the Western Arctic states? This is a really big problem for China because China wants to be able to work with everyone in the Arctic. But by choosing to work with Russia, it's almost forestalling its ability to work with other Arctic states. And then the third reason why we've seen kind of a pushback, a little bit of a slowdown in China's Arctic approach here, is that it's had a lot of pushback from Arctic governments. So like I mentioned, China has been trying to use foreign direct investment to engage in projects in Greenland, Russia, and Iceland, but often this has been unsuccessful. So in the mid-2010s, a lot of people saw this as a pretty big threat. There was a lot of alarmist rhetoric about China trying to buy territory close to the United States. This, would be a traditional threat. But actually, this didn't end up materializing in any serious sense. So authorities both in Denmark and Finland actually declined offers from Chinese investment organizations to purchase critical infrastructure across the region because they saw it as potentially damaging. Another aspect of China's approach, as I also kind of did here, is scientific research. So China is very much engaged in scientific research in the Arctic, in places like Svalbard. But interestingly, this research often intersects with China's strategic interests. So this is not, of course, just limited to China, but it is something that it's important to pay attention to when thinking about China in the Arctic, because these scientific missions are not often just scientific, but they act as cover for gaining access on data on shipping routes, for example. What are the military activities and capabilities of other Arctic states? And a lot of this comes down to a question of dual use concerns. So research vessels, icebreakers, they serve both the interests of military actors as well as civilian actors. So it raises a lot of interesting questions from an analytical perspective of what side should we believe? Can it not be both? And if it is both, how do we ensure that some of the benefits that China might get militarily can be curtailed in a way that still allows for that civilian capacity to continue? And just to give you an idea of how prevalent China is in the region, this map is a little bit old, but you can really see how active China is both in an extractive capacity, which are some of those purple little dots, a commercial capacity, which is the way that China's been able to use the Northern Sea Route to transfer goods and services, and from a research capacity, where their icebreakers have operated across the region as well. I also want to spend a moment talking about Russian and Chinese strategic cooperation. So over the past decade, we've seen Chinese and Russian naval vessels conducting joint maneuvers with greater frequency in both the Arctic and Arctic adjacent waters. We saw maritime maneuvers in 2017 in the Black Sea. China took part in the 2022 Vostok multilateral exercises that Russia oversaw. And we've seen joint transits near Alaska in 2022 and 2023. And Ukraine's situation, what's been happening since 22, has actually done a lot of work in pushing Russia and China closer together. And this raises a lot of questions. So what's the story of Russia and China in the Arctic? It's clearly more complex than an alliance. So it's important to kind of lay out what this might look like and how it impacts hybrid threats. So when we kind of first start thinking about, okay, China's buying Russian oil and gas, they're cooperating, that makes sense from an economic perspective. China's using the Northern Sea Route, again, this makes sense from an economic perspective. But now, Russia and China are working together in a maritime capacity. They're exercising together in the Bering Strait, which is quite close to Alaska. And now we've seen this jump where now Russian and Chinese military aircraft are able to work together, which raises a lot of questions about how close this partnership or marriage of convenience actually is. It's probably unlikely that this cooperation would extend into the realm of hybrid threats, because that's quite a jump forward in terms of cooperation. But it still raises some important questions about, well, we should prepare for possible coordination, or at least trying to understand if there's any possibility that they might try to be aware of one another's tactics and strategies and build upon how they're able to work with one another. So since February 2022, we've seen a couple of trends, as I've sort of previewed, come across. The first is we've seen an increase in Russian cyber activities. So not only have we been seeing kind of this vast expansion in general, but specifically a focus on governmental systems, which is interesting because we might expect there to be more of a focus on non-governmental systems to tease out vulnerabilities and weaknesses. But instead, we've been seeing more of a focus on parliamentary systems, electoral systems instead. The second is that there's been an increase in interference on critical infrastructure. So I mentioned some of the pipeline attacks, some of the sabotage attempts on undersea cables in the region, but we might expect this to continue as well, or at least that we might expect adversaries to try to understand what some of those vulnerabilities are and prepare for future attacks on those, as well as, of course, increase in GPS jamming as well. Another trend is that there's been an increase in cyber espionage, intelligence activity, and last, an increase in information influence operations. And this has largely to do with the fact that Russia is trying to narrate to communities in the European Arctic in particular that what's happening in Ukraine could impact them as well, because they understand that if you put pressure on local communities in the Arctic, that community may try to put pressure on the local government or then national government. So it's sort of this attempt to try to influence the politics on a strategic level by focusing on the civilian capacity. So you might be asking yourself, why does all of this matter? Maybe you're not located in the Arctic, where we're hearing this from right now, or you've never been to the Arctic. But of course, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the region. And it's important here to pay attention to the fact that the trends and patterns that we're watching China and Russia attempt to use in the region might be lessons or warning signs for other parts of the world as well. Of course, hybrid threats do not only impact militaries, but most importantly, impact civilian sectors and span economic, national security, and technological domains. And it has the potential for large-scale economic and strategic disruption. So, for example, should we expect this more attempted disruption efforts on pipelines, on undersea cables, to take place in Boston, for example, or Colorado? Or perhaps we should look for paying attention to different types of disinformation narratives that we've seen in the Arctic try to work outside as well. So what emerging practices do we see in the region? This is something we should be paying attention to, trying to locate outside as well. And then, of course, the last question is, what are the strategies that we're using in response to this? And I haven't focused overtly on that across this presentation, but responding to hybrid threats often comes down to thinking about societal resilience strategies, media literacy campaigns, trying to build up a resilient base to make sure that not only the community, but also the actual infrastructure that builds up that community can be resilient to any type of threat, whether it be conventional or hybrid in nature. But we need to understand that these strategies are very context-based. So it's not really going to work to come up with an Arctic 2025 hybrid threats resilience approach. So many of these are country-specific, they're community-specific. But what are lessons that maybe communities can draw from one another and see how they are becoming more successfully responding to these issues? So I will leave it at that. And thank you very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Gabriella, thank you so much. That was a very lucid, but also comprehensive presentation, and I super appreciate it. So I'm going to actually ask the first question because I'm dying to ask it. So How are the larger assumptions about the Arctic, from its frozenness, perceptions of isolation, non-competition, it's unpopulated, there's lots of reindeers and polar bears. How does that impact the threat assessment and reactions to the threat? And I'm talking not only about kind of military establishment, I'm thinking of the United States, but elsewhere, but and diplomats, but also the public and experts and things like that. So, yes.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So thank you for asking it. I think the first thing that comes up a lot of the time is that people assume that people experiencing hybrid threats are living in igloos in the middle of nowhere in the Arctic. So they think, oh, they're not prepared to deal with these threats. They haven't had to deal with them before. When in fact, many northern communities have been dealing with this type of threat for a long time. Not only are they not isolated, they're very connected to the South in many capacities, but they've been dealing with these issues from a Cold War perspective as well. So there's actually been some great interviews with people in Northern Norway, for example, that are talking about how this is not new for us. This is actually a return to normal. This is something we've been experiencing our whole lives. So I think it's important to kind of pay attention to the fact that not only should we be learning across each other, but perhaps throughout time as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I like how you also kind of brought in maybe these policymakers should also be seeking, advice and kind of communications with these populations that are living there a bit more. So the second question from the chat is the trade on the Northern Sea Route really working? And if you could speak a little bit more to the efficacy of that space and that infrastructure.
Sure. So interestingly, I think if you look at the numbers, the route itself is certainly more productive than it's been in the past, but it is by no means, the next global maritime shipping route. I think there's so much, we can go back to it, disinformation about the Northern Sea Route, where the Russian government talks about this is the most, successful it's ever been. Look at all of these ships coming through. But a lot of that traffic is actually intra-Russia. So it's from one Russian Arctic community to another. And actually, China's been really reticent about using the Northern Sea Route since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Because again, it's a little worried about the image here. So what does it look like for China to be using the Northern Sea Route? There are some costs that come along with that. My understanding is that perhaps it's being used a teensy bit more now, but at least for the first year or two of the war, there was a real reticence against using it.
Excellent. Thank you. So another question is, we talked about Russia and China as kind of threat actors in the region, but are there other actors outside of Russia and China that are considering the region, not just from like an economic perspective, but also from any sort of warfare threat kind of position?
I suppose, obviously the United States is kind of the unspoken actor here, right? Of course, the US wants to be more militarily engaged in the Arctic. We can see that through all of the surface strategies, the recent Department of Defense document as well. And I think it has maybe less to do with wanting to be military aggressively in the Arctic and wanting to engage presence. And so it's not just the United States that's doing that, but of course, NATO now has presence in the region, or more presence than it's had in the past. So I think a lot of people are turning towards the Arctic in a military capacity, not necessarily because they want to make war there, but because they want to show that they're able to operate there. And then outside of a military capacity, there are states like India, for example, that very much want to, I think the term that they use is the third pole dialogue, where they say, yes, there's the Antarctic, there's the Arctic, but there's also the Himalayas. And so we have a lot of similarities here. And it's kind of this question of how do you link yourself to the Arctic? And states try lots of different ways to do that.
I remember at Arctic Circle, like 5 or 6 years ago, the Swiss called themselves like a vertical Arctic state because they had mountains. So it's very interesting to see the language that develops and the slipperiness of that language, both in terms of affiliation and legitimacy in the region, but also in terms of types of threat and kind of how that throws sand in the cogs of how to react and figure out what's happening up there. So another question from the chat. I heard of a BRIC center that must be born in Svalbard. Is there any news on this BRIC center? And BRICS is think it's Brazil. Actually, no, India. Yeah, you can answer it.
Yeah, I think it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, maybe. Feels right to me. Yeah, my last knowledge of that is that Russia said they want to do a BRICS center, and a couple of other BRICS members said that they wanted to engage. Of course, if you are a treaty member of the Svalbard Treaty, you have the right to build a research center on the Norwegian archipelago, but I'm uncertain how far that's actually gone beyond just rhetoric.
Phil, do you have a question?
Yes, I actually do. Actually two questions by now. We were talking about India, right? So apparently Singapore also has some sort of claim now on the Arctic. Perhaps because when you shift the shipping route away from the Indian Ocean, that might also affect some traffic coming to Singapore. So there can be an economic impact. But what is the potential play for Singapore there when it comes to the Arctic? So that's question number one. Question number two is that according to the latest news that the Chinese Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard just did a joint exercise on the water across the coast of Japan up to through the Bering Sea in September. So to what extent, how significant is that one compared to previous joint exercise?
So speaking to the Singapore question, I'm not an expert on Singapore. I'll just put that out there first. But I could imagine that one way that Singapore is linked to the Arctic, or that they would like narrate that, is that there's a lot of kind of recent discourse talking about how the Arctic is really linked to the Indo-Pacific. And so when we talk about the Arctic, we're not just talking about that, we're talking about the Bering Strait, and then we're talking about global shipping that actually goes entirely down there. So at a recent conference I was at, I think all we talked about was the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific and how close they are together, which I found really interesting because that seems kind of like a new discourse that's emerging. And to speak to the recent Coast Guard exercises, I think it's important to emphasize that it's very much a coordination that they're working on together, that their militaries, at least to my understanding, are not, working really closely and interoperable with one another, but rather it's this question of being able to coordinate together in the Arctic. And a lot of this is probably an intimidation kind of strategy against Alaska, kind of showing not only can we operate in Russian waters, but we can operate in the high seas very close to your exclusive economic zones. I think it is very significant. There's no question about it. But I think giving too much weight to increasing Russian-Chinese collaboration actually gives it more strength when we do that. So it's important to pay attention to how we are seeing that increase over time, and like the type of coordination is kind of expanding in nature, but that we need to kind of pare down our expectations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we have a bunch of really interesting questions in the chat, but sadly we do have to finish. So participants, thank you so much for coming. If you want to reach out to Gabriella either on LinkedIn or her website to ask these questions, please go ahead. And as always, please reach out to Phil and I if you have any speaker recommendations or feedback. We'd love to hear it. Tomorrow at 9:15 a.m., but 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, we have John Mikael Stordal, who will be talking about, he's the director of NATO's Technology and Science Outreach Office, and he will be talking about NATO's technological edge. So please come and join that. The link, you can also register as well through the alumni links. So thank you so much.
Olivia, just add a few points here. So for those who are interested in the connection from a cooperation standpoint that some of you might notice, we will have this tomorrow session will be great to join, and we will also spend perhaps the first 10 minutes to go through some of the key talking points, some of the unanswered questions perhaps from today. So feel free to join the session tomorrow early, around 9 a.m. Boston time, right? Which is 3 p.m. Oslo time. And we will also have a class from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy dialing in to join the discussion for tomorrow. And the other highlight to mention here is that also on October 23rd, we have another expert, Sonko Marin, who had just spent several years posted at the European Center for Countering Hybrid Threats. He will bring some additional perspective on the state of hybrid warfare in the Arctic. So October 23rd. So
one more follow-up too, just to keep plugging. We have a speaker named Alina Baikova, who is also associated with the Arctic Institute and is a scholar at Stanford, and she will be talking about Svalbard in much more specificity. So if you're interested in Svalbard, please look out for announcements on that. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.